Folks on Zoom, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. All right. Is the blackboard too dark for you folks? If you use it, is it? I think there should be some lights here. Does that require the key as well? Oh, it's working, okay. All right. Sorry for the delay. All right, welcome all. So today we are going to pick up from the last lecture. We were talking about the telemetry systems. And the last thing that we discussed in last lecture was the hybrid telemetry systems. These are the ones that are trying to offload or like execute the query across two different type of targets, one being the programmable hardware switch and the other being the user space, or like leveraging the stream processors in the user space. Okay, and the argument that we had here was that this is better than the two extreme choices that you have, which is like you either execute the entire query in the switch or you execute the entire query in the user space. So can anybody, just as a refresher, can tell me why it doesn't make sense to execute the entire set of queries on the hardware switch?
Not that much memory on the switch.
Okay, that translates to
Process everything quickly, or just have everything in general.
okay, that's fair enough. Anything else? Anybody want to add? Okay, so both these points are correct, that it has limited memory and it has limited flexibility in terms of compute capabilities that you have in the hardware switch. And what that translates into is that either you're not able to support a wide range of these queries, right? So which might have a diverse set of compute requirements, or you might, even if you are able to, like even if you have the compute resources, you might still not be able to support them at higher data rates because you might require more memory than what's available in the data plane, right? Or what's available in these hardware targets. And that's the reason why, like even though the community has explored that to the depth, and there are a lot of solutions out there that try to optimize the use of memory, right? And this is something that we were maybe referring. Yes, so this is the set of work that has been done. I'm referring to slide 8. So this is the set of work that has been done, which is trying to basically optimize the use of memory. And the key idea there is that they're trying to come up with new data structures that were developed in the theory community and try to apply that in context of the network, telemetry problems with these hardware switches. And the set of ideas were to use sketches. And sketches are basically these more efficient, like, when you're trying to do stateful operation, you try to use a hash table, right? So you try to maintain some state, do a count. So that's the most basic thing that we can do. And this line of work focuses more on, like coming up with better stateful data structures, right? So sketches are relatively more advanced stateful data structures that use less memory, but then provide some approximate guarantees on the accuracy of these queries, right? So for example, if you require maybe 50 megabytes of memory for a particular stateful operation, if you're using these type of approximate data structures or these sketches, then you might be able to fit everything within 5 megabytes of memory, but then you might have an accuracy hit of 5% or 2% on the queries that you're trying to run, right? So this is the trade-off that the community has explored, and this is still an active area of research. When you look at these top research venues out there, there is always a paper which is coming up with some new set of ideas of like doing the counts in the data plane, or like running these type of, or executing these queries in the data plane. But then the fundamental limit is that you have limited memory, you have limited flexibility, right? So even if we assume that the new data structures that the researchers can come up with can solve the problem of memory as a restriction or as a limitation, but still the compute operations that are supported in the data plane will restrict the set of queries that you can support if you're just using the data plane, right? So far, the argument is clear. Okay. All right. So now we're going to today focus on Sonata as one of the system that is that the community also calls this as a hybrid telemetry system, because it is using these like it's in the middle, right? So it's using these programmable data plane targets, but it is not just using one type of target, it is using mix of both targets, right? So it's also referred to as a hybrid telemetry system. And what Sonata is trying to offer is that at a high level, it is focusing on flexibility, right? So it is leveraging this. And in the last lecture, we discussed that, like if you have the abstraction where you can express the analytics task at the granularity of packet tuples, where you have all possible information that you need from the network. And if you support expressing those tasks as data flow queries, then that is the extreme level of flexibility that you can have, right? And Sonata is aiming for that. It is saying that like we will let you, as a network operator, you can express your analytics tasks at the packet level granularity. You can treat packet as a tuple. You have access to all fields that the packet is offering. And then you can express your analytics task as a data flow query, right? So data flow meaning sequence of data flow operators that can be applied. So think of map, reduce, distinct, filter. So these are the examples of data flow operators, and you can apply your analytics task as a sequence of these operators together. And that's how you can express these complex analytics queries. And this is something which is in line with the analytics community in general, that when people are thinking of, especially when people are thinking of streaming analytics, data flow is a very, very popular abstraction that people are using, that there is a stream of tuple that is coming in, and then you're applying the sequence of data flow operators to extract insight from that data, right? So that's the abstraction that Sonata is leveraging, that is already out there, so that you don't really have to be a network operator to express these type of analytics tasks, right? That's kind of like the message that the Sonata was saying, is like, the evolution of the community is such that rather than thinking that we will need expert network operators to write these type of analytics tasks, we probably need data scientists to think about the problems in the networking, right? And if we ask them to write P4 programs that you folks are learning, that's going to be a really big threshold for them to participate in this process, right? So provide as high level of abstraction as possible so that they can express the analytics tasks. So that is the flexibility argument that Sonata is saying, right? But once you provide this extreme level of flexibility, you can imagine that supporting scalability or scaling these type of queries is going to be extremely challenging. And this is exactly where Sonata comes in, that there's this fundamental gap that exists between flexibility and scalability. When scalability, because we have limited resources overall, right? So we have limited compute resources, we have limited memory resources, and between the switches and these user space devices, we have limited bandwidth as well, right? So it's not always possible. If I have a network which is handling terabits of traffic, I don't have a bandwidth of terabits capacity between the switch and the user space, right? So maybe I have 10 Gbps, 1 Gbps. So that also is a restriction or a constraint that we have to deal with when we're thinking of these pipelines, right? So Sonata is basically trying to bridge this gap, and it is bridging this gap first by offering abstraction that we talked about, so that people can express a wide range of analytics tasks as data flow queries. And it is coming up with these algorithms that we will study now, that are translating or that are enabling it to scale the execution of these queries, right? And Sonata basically is a system that is gluing these high-level abstractions with these low-level algorithms, which are, or you can think of them as query planning algorithms, that you are given set of queries as the input, and then it is trying to figure out what is the right way of executing those queries. So those are also called query planning algorithms. And Sonata is basically realization and instantiation of these two pieces together. Any questions so far? All right, so now that we understand that Sonata is kind of offering this extreme flexibility, it's not very hard to intuit that when we're trying to support these flexible queries, and we're saying that we want to support multiple of them running concurrently, right? So it doesn't make sense for a network operator to just run one query at a time, right? There are so many things that can be happening in the network and the network operator is mostly interested in running multiple queries at a time. And this is also, in some sense, a fundamental difference between Sonata and some of the previous works, because a lot of previous works focus on just one query at a time, right? So those are kind of like research artifacts, and it's just an intellectual exercise to think about, okay, how will the scalability problem work when you have one query at a time? But in practice, you will, or you want to support execution of multiple queries concurrently, right? That's very critical. And that just, explodes the scalability problem to another level, right? Like supporting one query at scale is already challenging. But when you're saying that I want to support, 5 queries or 10 queries or maybe hundreds of queries concurrently, that's an extremely daunting task to think about, right? And then the argument is that where exactly is this type of system going to be useful? Is it useful when I'm running it on my laptop? Or is it useful when I'm running on the access point? Or is it useful when I'm running at the border router? And as you can see, right, like, the scale is going to be completely different as we move up in this hierarchy, right? So laptop is probably a few megabits of traffic. Data rate is around a few megabits or maybe tens of megabits. The access point is maybe Gbps or maybe 10 Gbps. And then when we are going up in the network, like going more towards the core of the network, then we're talking about hundreds of Gbps of workload, right? So the Sonata is technically should be flexible, that it should be able to run anywhere. But the extreme scalability challenge will be where the volume of traffic is extremely high, right? So think about the border router that we have at UCSB, where all the traffic in and out is visible. And I might want to run queries there because I see the whole spectrum of traffic that is coming in. And if there is an attack, that is the right place to run that query, right? But that is a place where we will be dealing with extreme scalability challenges. But still, UCSB is a small network. Think about Verizon. And Verizon is actually interested in deploying Sonata on their network. But for them, the challenge is that the best place for them to deploy a Sonata-like system is the core of their network. And when we talk about core of Verizon's network, we're talking about hundreds of Gbps of workload that it has to handle, right? So now we are setting up against an extremely challenging scenario or environment where we are saying that we want to support these multiple queries. We want to support hundreds of Gbps of workload at the same time, right? And in principle, this sounds like a crazy dream to be achievable, because nobody has done that before, right? This was when Sonata was out there. Nobody did this type of work before. People were happy running one query at a time. People were happy running that on 1 Gbps, 10 Gbps workload. But setting this goal that, okay, we want to concurrently support these tens of queries, we want to concurrently run all these queries on a hundreds of Gbps workload is an extremely challenging task. And from research perspective, it is always important to like set some ambitious goals, right? So you can either solve an incremental problem, which just improves the existing state of the art and get done with it, or you can set yourself up for the ambitious problem. And sometimes it is important, like you might not be able to solve that ambitious problem in the one go, and multiple iterations might be required. But at the same time, you might be adding a lot of value to a particular research area by setting a very high goal post, which is ambitious but valuable, right? And that motivates the community broadly to follow that direction. And then then there will be incremental contribution that will eventually help us to take to that goal. But overall, I think it is very, very important to envision that what is this one big problem that we really need to solve as a community, right? So Sonata was successful in motivating that what that solution should be. I don't think Sonata solves all those problems that it aims for, but it is a step in the right direction, right? And we should take Sonata, that's the solution that we're learning today, as just a small step in this ambitious goal that we are setting of hundreds of Gbps, any type of dynamism in the workload, any type of queries as an input workload. That's the ultimate goal. Sonata does not solve all those problems, but I think the design choices that it has made will help us understand and appreciate how we can reach to that goal. Okay. So quick revision on the type of resources that we have available before we talk about how we can scale this type of query execution. And this is something that most of you are extremely familiar with now, the Pisa processing model. What happens in Pisa is that there are these packets coming in. You have a programmable parser. You can specify what fields you want to extract. Once you do that, then you translate the binary or the raw information in the packet's header into a packet header vector, right? Now, this packet header vector is the one that is traversing across multiple stages of compute, and all these stages are, equally provisioned or have the equal set of resources in general, right? So, what are the resources that we have in each of the stage? we have memory in the form of TCAM and SRAM. We have a bunch of ALUs, right? With, of course, limited capabilities in terms of what type of arithmetic operations you can perform. And so these are the key resources, right? So like memory, like I have black and green. So you can think of the green one as the SRAM memory that is helpful for the stateful operations. And you can think of the black one as the TCAM memory that is useful for the wildcard matching type of operations. So this is the kind of like, you have these equally, provisioned stages of compute that the packet header vector has to go through. And then at the end, the packet header vector is translated back into a packet header, right? And then the payload, which is extracted from the packet at the ingress, is then added back to the packet, and then packet just goes through the wire, right? So this is how the Pisa processing model really works. Now, what's important and interesting to think is that there is a connection between the processing model that Pisa has with the data flow model or abstraction that like analytics tasks in general have, right? And that's very important to understand and appreciate here, is that the data flow and data plane, the processing model of Pisa, both are pipelines, right? They're processing something. They have some processing units. So in case of data plane, that is the match action tables that are the processing units. In case of data flow, it's the operators that are the processing units, right? And then it is operating over some structured data. So in case of data flow, that structured data is tuple. In case of data plane, the structured data is packets, right? So there is, like, you can see that similarity. Both of them are pipeline. Both of them have some set of processing units, and both of them are operating over structured data. So the researchers started thinking that, is it possible to leverage this similarity that we have between data flow abstraction and the processing model that we have for Pisa switches and do something with it, right? And in simple words, researchers started questioning that, is it possible to compile some of these data flow operators into match action tables, right? And if we can do that, we can, like, we're already capable of treating packets as a tuple. If we can map these operators as match action tables, then we can support the same pipeline. We can support the data flow pipeline in the switch itself, right? And that is something that is, critical if we want to execute these queries in the hardware switch, right? We don't have to compromise significantly on this extreme translation of the high-level queries into the P4 program if this mapping is relatively straightforward. So now let's try to, visualize that. What does it really mean when we say we want to compile a data flow operator into the switch? And let's take an example with a filter operation, right? So can anybody explain me what, filter predicate P, what does that mean? Has anybody worked with data flow queries before? Okay, so let's take it slow and try to make sure that we understand the principles here correctly. Okay, you want to get, yeah. Exactly. So you have a stream of elements as input. Then when you write a filter, you have some predicate rules that are the match rules that need to be checked. And then if the stream of elements, whatever input element satisfies that predicate, that is the output. Whatever does not is not the output, right? So in some sense, it's like inherently ignored, right? Now, I think this is important from the network perspective, that if I naively apply this as a match action table, where I'm saying that, hey, say if you remember this query, right? So where we were saying that we will be looking at the UDP source port being 53, right? Which is the DNS response messages, right? Remember the queries from last class? So there the predicate is pretty straightforward, right? It is match on the UDP source port. And if it is 53, then the action is to, accept that packet, right? But if I'm a bit naive here, and if I can say okay, the action is to take it to the next stage, or accept this packet. And if it doesn't match it, which is the figure above, then drop it, right? So I don't really want to drop the packet, because this is this is a query that I'm running on the packets, but this is not my routing policy or something, right? This is not something that I really want to implement in the data plane as a policy. I'm just interested in running some analytics on the UDP or the DNS response packets, right? But doesn't mean that I want to drop all the other traffic here, right? So it is so I cannot apply a match action table and say okay, if it matches port 53, then accept it, otherwise drop it. That is not a good policy to have. So what we should be doing instead is that we should be adding a metadata field in the packet, right? Which says that, okay, this is some query, say query one. So for query one, it might have a field which is like, whether this packet should be, forwarded to the next stage or it should be not forwarded to the next stage, right? A binary variable. So when I apply the action here, the action should be to set that metadata variable, not drop the packet, right? Otherwise, the only packet that will go through will be the DNS response packet, and that's not what we really want to do here. Okay, so this is how we can compile a particular operator into the match action tables. And like, what is unique about this operator is that there is no state, right? I'm not really looking at a sequence of packets, extracting some state from it, and then making decisions, right? I'm just working on one packet at a time. So you can think of this as a stateless operator, right? There is no state required. I'm not looking at any information that is extracted across multiple packets. I'm just looking at one packet at a time, okay? So let's understand the stateful operator. And we discussed the reduce operator in the last lecture as well. So what is a reduce operator? Can anybody take a guess? What is a reduce operator? Yeah, take a guess.
Every element and then simultaneously has like another element that's
Yes, absolutely. So basically what reduce with function f says is that if I have the stream of elements as input, I'm going to apply this function f on the stream of element, and whatever is the output, I will just report that, right? So this is the most simplistic definition of reduce operator. Of course, it's a it's a topic of its own, and people have explored a lot in that. But this is the most simplistic way of explaining what reduce operator means. And this function can be anything, right? So when we are trying to, like, for the example that we were discussing earlier, the function is just a simple sum operation, right? So if I'm just trying to count the number of packets, then I will increment that value by 1 every time I see a new stream of element, right? Element in the stream, right? Is that clear? So if there are 5 packets coming in, if the function is sum, then the output value will be 5. Okay, but I can apply something else as well here.
You say, so some just counts the number of packets, but in the previous code we did like a map, destination ID, source ID, destination ID, comma 1. What was the point of 1?
So that is like, so basically, like, you can always count the packet in general, but there we were counting the number of source IPs, right? So then we are like, saying that one source IP is just one element in that tuple or one tuple. Then applying a sum will just count the number of source IPs.
So if we replace, if the map said, if you map the destination ID, comma 2, it would double the sum.
Yes, it can double the count. It will double the count. Yes. So again, map is also an example of a stateless operator, right? So it will be doing some one-to-one mapping between the input packet and the output tuple, but it is not maintaining any state, right? So it is used for arbitrary transformation that you can support. And this is actually a good example. Like, maybe I should go back here, that the line 5 here, right? So you first look at the DNS response, then you extract the unique pairs of source IP, destination IP, right? So like, from the packet, you apply a map operator, which is a simple stateless operator. It will just read the source IP, destination IP, right? And then it will apply a distinct operator. So the distinct is a stateful operator. So it will only output distinct pairs of source IP and destination IP, right? So if there are hundreds of like source IP, destination IP pair, but out of them only there are 10 unique pairs of destination IP and source IP, then it will only output those 10 pairs of those source IP and destination IP, right? And then the final stage, or like the next stage, is that a map operator, where it is replacing the source IP with 1, because we are eventually interested in counting the number of source IP addresses that are sending traffic to each of the destination IP, right? So that is why we are doing the stateless transformation, replacing source IP by 1, and then doing a reduce with the function of sum. So now we are trying to count the number of source IPs that are associated with each of those destination IP, right? So at the end of this query, for every destination IP, we will have a count of how many source IPs were sending DNS response to this destination IP, right? And then the next step is to compare it with a threshold and see if any of those destination IPs were exceeding, or the number of source IPs sending traffic to the particular destination IP is exceeding a threshold or not, right? Okay, so going back to this reduced discussion, we will, like, to apply this function f for every time a packet is coming in, I need to know what was the value before this packet, right? So if I'm counting up to 5, a packet comes in, I have to do +1, but like +1 on what, right? So I need to know what was the previous value. So 1, the next comes to 2, then 2 is the value that I need to store, and then the next packet comes in, then +1, then 3 is the next value that I need to store, and so on and so forth, right? So we need some type of stateful memory that we can use for these type of stateful operators, right? And of course, we know that the Pisa switches do support memory, right? The SRAM memory that is available. And as we have discussed before as well, that this SRAM memory is though expensive, but it can support read-write operations at line rate, right? Line rate meaning that you can, the delay in read and write operations for these memory is of the order of nanoseconds, right? And which means that the rate at which the packets are coming in, we are just requiring few nanoseconds of delay for updating these values, stateful values, okay? So focusing on this line number 6, where we are trying to apply this reduce operator, as we were discussing that, for every destination IP, we want to count number of source IPs. So there are 2 set of operations that need to be done. First is that we need to update the value for a particular, like key, right? And maybe I should use the Blackboard just to make this discussion clear. Okay. So right, so this is the basic abstraction of the stateful memory that we need, right? So whenever a particular packet comes in, or not packet in this case, a tuple is coming in, right? So you are applying these set of stateful operations where a packet came in, right? So let's go to the basics, right? So packet came in, then we applied a table which was doing a filter, right? So let's call this as the, right? So match and action, right? And then the rule that was applied here was that UDP source port equal to 53, right? And then if it is 53, then you will say like, accept, like let's move on to the next stage of processing, right? So let's say this is 1, or like let's use the symbolic representation here. So this is the first operator that has been applied, right? Now what will happen? It says that we need to take a pair of source IP, destination IP. So this is a simple operation. We don't really need a match action table for a map operation. We can just update all this at the ingress, where we are reading these values from the packet and putting it into the packet's metadata, right? So we don't need an explicit match action table here. So let's assume that that information is already available, right? And then the other map operation, oh, sorry, now we have a distinct operation, right? So what do we really need as a distinct operation? Can anybody tell me what should a distinct operation do? How will it do that? So we said we need a memory, right? So there has to be a memory, there has to be a match action table, but how can we achieve that goal? So there is a hint in the slide, but it's for a different operator, but we are talking about distinct. So how can we execute that for distinct? Right, so we need one match action table. Yeah, let's do this. Okay, so maybe we can have some count here. So we need some type of stateful memory where we are keeping track of key and value pair, right? So when we say key, what does the key mean, right? So key is basically an identifier of the tuple that we are processing. So in this case, as we were saying that like we are interested in source IP and destination IP, right? So what this table should technically do is that it should take a combination of source IP and destination IP, and it should compute a hash value that corresponds, like that does a one-to-one mapping between the source IP and destination IP. So again, match action, and for every traffic that is coming in, it will compute some hash value, right? Is that clear? And what is the input to this hash? It is the source IP and destination IP. Okay. Now, once this hash is computed, I can now send this to another match action table where I will apply the operator, like where I will apply the stateful operation that, okay, like check whether this key exists in this table or not. If not, then add it. If it already exists, then just move forward, right? And this is how we can get all these unique pairs of source IP and destination IP. Is that clear? Okay. So now let's assume that, we are able to perform this operator. Then the next stage, the input will be the pairs of, like unique pairs of source IP and destination IP, right? Now we need another, like we can ignore the source IP because we want to do the count for destination IP. Then we need another set of match action tables. You folks can see that, right? Yeah. So we need another pair of match action tables where we are going to compute the hash on just the destination IP, right? And then we will use another table. Where is the table? Yeah, this one, right? So this is the table that for every destination IP, we will have some count. And then we will, like use another match action table, which is going to update the count. And that's how things will work, right? So at the end of the day, once we have some type of input stream, we will have this table updated, which will feed the next set of tables. And then we will have this state or hash table maintained, which will have the number of counts for every destination IP. And then you can apply another match action table to compare that with a threshold and then report any destination IP that is exceeding the threshold here, right? So, like, the most important bit of information here is that it is possible to compile these data flow operators into match action tables, right? That is a bigger takeaway, that the type of processing that is required to execute a particular data flow operator that is technically supported in the hardware targets, right? And this is a bit of a generalization here because not everything is supported, right? So we have to be cautious about what we claim in terms of generalizability. When we say reduce F, right? So the type of function that we can apply is limited by the capabilities of the hardware target. So I can do some, I can do any type of bit operations in general, but what I cannot do is like a multiplication operation or anything that requires division or something, right? So those are the set of, like, I cannot support any arbitrary function as a reduce operator, like with reduce operator, but there are these simple counts and all those things that I can support, right? So that is a limitation of the type of processing that we can do in the hardware. Yes.
Yes. Processing pipeline just keep running. So if I'm going to DNS request or a DNS response from 20 servers over 3 weeks,
yeah,
is there like a temporal Pisa?
Yes, that's an excellent question, because whenever we talk about streaming analytics, there is always some type of reference of time, right? So whenever you compute these stateful operators, there has to be some reference, right? So either that reference is time, or that reference is like, number of packets, or like number of tuples that you have as input, right? So you can compute this function for every 10 packets or 100 packets, or you can compute this for every 1 second, 10 second, 1 minute, 10 minutes type of thing, right? So whenever you report these numbers, whenever you compute or like compare it with some threshold, there has to be always a reference of time, right? And so the way Sonata works, and we're going to cover that more, the way it works is that it is reporting these numbers at the granularity of 3 seconds, right? And 3 seconds might sound like a magic number, but it is a perfect trade-off between how fast it can reconfigure the pipeline for the next window and the type of overheads that it has to deal with when it is reconfiguring this pipeline over time. So given this 3 second is the perfect or the most is the shortest time window that Sonata can support, given the challenges that it has at runtime reconfiguring these match action tables, right? Yeah.
And if the cell is stored in the actual switch memory, does the monitor have to send the reset packet, or does the switch have to send it?
Yes, that's an again excellent question, because this was one of the challenges of Sonata in general, that when it was first out, like best will be that if I can send just one command and reset everything, right? But the initial versions of the hardware target, they didn't support that functionality, right? And because this is all, I think Sonata came out 2018 SIGCOMM, but it was, the prototype was developed in 2017 to 2016 timeframe. that's when RMT targets or Pisa targets were extremely new. So they had very limited support in terms of capabilities. So initial target was kind of like, they had some, hacks around it. But the most recent version of Sonata is leveraging this new capability where you just send one command and everything is just reset, right? But that said, like a lot of time you might have to read these specific values that you have in the stateful, like these are called registers as well. So, like you are configuring a register and defining what is the key, what is the value that you're specifying. The pipeline, the way I was explaining it, it is possible to do all this in a streaming fashion that, like if the count exceeds the threshold, you just report that key to the next stage, which is basically the user space part. But there might be cases where you have to read each and every value here, right? So this is something which, like the community has also struggled, that if there's a lot of state that is out there, what should be the right approach of reading that? So people came up with some new abstraction called packet ferries, right? So the idea was that if you want to read each and every value, you send some crafted packets to the switch, and you have some processing logic in place, which knows that, okay, if this is a packet ferry coming in, and which specifies like, I can customize that packet, which says like, this is the specific indexed value that I really want to read, right? So it can pull the value, or it can read the value and put it into the packet. And then this packet ferry will be like, you can think of that as a control plane mechanism that is trying to read this, right? And of course, now you might wonder that, why can't I just send a CLI command and then read that specific value? Because then you are like overwhelming the control channel, right? With the packet ferries, you're sending through the ports, the normal ports, which are 100 gig capable. If you're sending this with the control part or the control loop, then you're like, maybe limited by 1 gig or 10 gig channels, right? So this is like packet ferry is a concept that has been like, I was not planning to discuss that, but I think like in light of our discussions and understanding that you understand how, or like realizing how well you understand the P4 targets or Pisa targets in general, packet ferry is a relatively recent concept that is used to extract insight from the stateful registers that are out there.
Final question.
Mm-hmm.
Since encryption is like a pretty complex thing for a switch to handle, what would prevent me from sending a packet ferry to one and getting there?
You can't run that. So the packet ferries will only work if you own those switches, right? So I cannot send that to AT&T and extract, that then otherwise I can just launch attacks and stuff, right? So no, that's not the model. The model is that if you are AT&T trying to run Sonata on your network, then you can use packet ferries to extract the state and then make better decisions about how you want to, configure this pipeline in the future.
Sure, it has a switch discern between me and AT&T.
Sorry, what?
How does the switch itself discern between me and AT&T?
So it can discern based on the set of ports from where the traffic is coming. Yeah. But also I think, like that's a good question. And like, I don't think there is a very fundamental solution to that problem, because if AT&T is running that on a production switch, and if I know exactly the type of topology that AT&T is using, I can technically trick the system to, launch an attack. And I don't think like, this is probably a question for the Pisa switches in general, that, how do you do access control in the data plane, right? And there is no good mechanism of enabling access control in the data plane. And such an attack is possible. But right now, people are not really thinking about those problems, because you can just manually configure or control the topology and restrict access from certain set of ports that you don't think are belonging to your organization. Okay. All right. So was this part clear that, the original goal was that, if it will be great if we can compile some of the data flow operators into the hardware target. And we discussed that, using these combination of match action tables, it is possible to compile both stateful as well as stateless operators into the hardware target. The stateful operators require some type of memory, but it is available. Stateless operators usually don't require any additional stages. But when we are trying to compile a stateful operator, then usually it entails leveraging 1 or 2 stages, right? Especially when we are talking about the distinct and reduce, you have to use one stage to compute the hash value, and then the other stage to use this SRAM register to update the values, right? So now that we understand that at the individual operator level, we know how to compile that operator. Now the next question is, can we compile the entire query, given we know how we can compile an individual operator, right? And I think, like, as you can already intuit, that's pretty straightforward. All you really need to do is just plumb these pieces together, such that, like you have a sequence of operators in the query, you know what match action tables are required to execute each of those operators. All you need to do is just connect them together so that the packet just flows through all these match action tables together, right? And I gave you a hint that, you know, like rather than dropping an actual packet, we can update the packet's metadata and add some metadata fields into the packet that are specific to the query, which keeps track of whether this packet should go to the next stage, should go to the next stage, right? So this is a very simple example, but you know, D1, D2, and R1, R2 is basically, you know, representing that we need 2 stages for distinct and 2 stages for reduce. And you know, like you can require a stage for map depending on how you implement, or you can push all these type of stateless operators into one, you know, the first stage as well. And then eventually you need 1 stage for the filter operation that is part of this query as well, right? So now that we understand that, okay, it is possible to compile individual operators, it is possible to combine all these operators or match action tables together to compile the entire query. Now the question is that given a particular query, what portion of the query should go on the switch and what portion of this query should go on the user space server, right? That is a question to answer. And like, you know, before we discuss why we need to do that, realize that the switches have limited resources, right? So if I have one query, maybe it's an easy choice that let's push everything. But if the type of operator that I'm supporting, like, you know, the reduce operator has some function which I cannot support into the data plane, or it is extracting some fields from the packet that I cannot parse in the data plane, right? So if it is, say, running a query on the payload part of the field, I cannot extract payload, then I have to send that part or send that packet to the user space so that the payload extraction can happen, and then the query can run there, right? So because of all these reasons, we have to make some decisions about what needs to be executed in the switch and what needs to be executed in the user space, okay? So this is where the query planner, or you can think of it as a layer that is making decisions about, you know, how exactly to execute a particular query, any particular input query. And the decision it has to make is that, okay, like, you know, it will execute part of the query in the switch, and then whatever is the output of that partial query will be sent as, you know, like output to the user space. So you can think of that as stream processor, and then stream processor will take that as the input tuple and then apply the remainder of the query, right? So this is how the partitioning can work. The query planner has to take, when it is making these decisions, it has to take the resources available on the switch as input. And it also has to, for every decision it makes, it needs to make sure that that decision is helping reduce the load at the stream process or at the user space process, right? So if I make any choice which is not really helping reduce the load, then it's not really a good decision, right? But I need to make sure that whatever choices I make, like the switch has enough resources to execute that part of the query in the switch, right? And you know, like when you think of this specific query, when you're applying the sequence of operators, and especially when you're applying a stateful operator, right? So you're reducing the amount of tuples that have to go to the next stage, right? So suppose the input packet stream had 1 million total packets, right? But it only had maybe 1,000 or 10,000 unique pairs of source IP destination IP. So after applying the distinct operator, the number of tuples that need to be sent for the further processing are already reduced, right? And if I apply the reduce operator, which is only the distinct IP, maybe there are only 1,000 distinct IP addresses, right? So number of tuples have further decreased, right? So there is this continuity, or like there is this monotonicity that is there in a particular stateful, like in a particular data flow query, that especially if you apply the stateful operators, then the number of tuples that you have to process further just keeps on decreasing, right? So if I just have one query as input, it's a very simple decision, right? Let's try to push as many operators as possible into the switch, because more I can push into the switch, more I can reduce the load for the server, right? That's very straightforward. But remember that we set ourselves against this more arduous task, that we don't want to just support one query. We want to concurrently support multiple queries, right? And when you have these multiple queries as input, then it becomes a bit of a challenging problem, because now you have to decide that, you know, what is the opportunity cost of pushing one extra operator for a particular query down into the switch? Will it increase the load? Will it decrease the load, right? And then it, you know, this basically translates into an optimization problem, where the goal is that I want to reduce the number of tuples that I send to the stream process or the server for further processing, right? That's my goal. I want to make sure that that workload or that load is as low as possible. And I have to deal with some constraints here, right? So before I, you know, enumerate that, let's have a quick discussion. Like, what are the constraints that we have in the switch? Yes. But what type of resources? Memory. Other constraints? Key functionalities, okay. Compute functionality. So basically the type of ALUs that you have. Okay. What else? Huh? So bandwidth is in some sense a goal that we want to minimize the number of tuples that go to the stream processor. That is kind of like a goal. Like, we want to reduce, because more tuples we send to the stream processors, longer it will take, or like more resources it will require in the stream processor to, support a particular data rate. Right? But there are more constraints that, based on the description that I provided here, there are more constraints to take into consideration. Yes. Yes. So in some sense, we know that there are these, like uniform amount of resources available at different stages. So if I'm thinking of maximum number of match action tables I can support, it's basically the number of stages that I have for processing, right? What was the answer that you gave before? Was that memory? Okay, so we talked about memory. We talked about number of stages. We also talked about the type of, type of compute resources that you have. Or maybe the other way of looking at it is like, like the total number of ALUs that you have in the switch, right? So that is another constraint. But there's one more constraint that we should think here. So remember that when I was explaining how we apply the filter operator, I was saying that I need to add this information into packet's metadata, right? Do we have infinite amount of metadata in packet? No? Okay. So what is limiting the amount of metadata that we can have in a particular packet? What is the fundamental limit? Remember, packet comes in, it goes through a packet parser, right? Programmable packet parser, and then you translate it into what? A parser is translating a packet into packet header vector. Okay. A particular switch is always designed for a finite amount of bits that you can have in a packet header vector, right? Like, basically you are like, the switch is designed such that it can arbitrarily access any part of this packet header vector, take that as input to the ALUs, and support all these operations that you want, right? So there is a limit on how many bits we can have in the packet header vector. Now, when you have a packet header vector, then there are a few things that you have to take into consideration. One is that when I write this programmable parser, I might want to extract each and every possible bit or field in the packet, right? So if it is a UDP packet, TCP packet, then I need to extract all of them. And I need dedicated space where I will always find a UDP, port number, or TCP port number, or protocol value, or maybe the options part of TCP, the options part of UDP, right? So there are these all sorts of possible combinations out there. And when I'm designing the switch, I don't know whether the traffic is going to be UDP or TCP. So if I want specific location for each and every packet field, then I need to put allocate some location for UDP packet header fields and TCP packet header fields, irrespective of whether it's a TCP or UDP packet, right? Packet comes in, if there is no UDP field extracted, then all those bits will be 0, right? But I need some dedicated space for them, right? So in some sense, given this, flexibility that we have in terms of packet headers that are possible that we are trying to support, then we need some dedicated space for all the packet headers as well, right? If they're not present, they will all be set to 0. But if they're present, then I have to update those values, and I will update them using the programmable parser. Okay. But now I have already spent, I have a finite amount of packet header vector, like number of bits that I can have in a particular packet header vector. I have to spend a lot of those bits to just extract the standard header information from the packet, right? So that leaves even smaller amount of space for me to store the metadata information, right? So the metadata information now that we're talking about here was that, for this particular query, should I accept this packet for the next stage of processing or not, right? So now this is putting some constraints in terms of how much information I can store in packets metadata, and that becomes a constraint, right? If I'm trying to support too many queries, then I have to have too many query specific metadata fields. If I can, like, if I have only enough information to save it for 10 queries, then I cannot support the 11th query. It doesn't matter how much memory is available, how many ALUs are available, right? Is that making sense? Okay. So the type of constraints here, packet header vector size, we talked about that. The number of actions, basically the match action tables or the ALUs that we were talking about, the amount of stateful memory that we have, and the total number of stages, right? So another constraint that is not evident here is that the stateful memory also has a subtle nuance, right? So the memory is always associated with some type of ALU that you have in a particular stage, right? So if, say, for example, if I have 2 megabytes of memory available in the stage, a single ALU cannot access the entire 2 megabytes, right? So there is a cap on how much a single ALU can use, and there's a cap on how much total memory that you have available in a particular stage, right? So typically it is like, if 2 megabytes is available, a single ALU can use around 1 megabyte of the total memory. In all the 4 or 8 ALUs that you have, they can total use 2 megabytes of memory, but the max that a single ALU can is usually the half of the total available in that stage, right? So this is something that we have to take into consideration, because when we're trying to make decisions about executing a particular stateful operator into the data plane, then we have to say, like, okay, how much memory can I max allocate to a particular operator here, right? So now we have a good sense of how we can partition the query given all this insight that we have. So we when I say we, basically the authors of this work formulated this as an integer linear program with the goal that they want to minimize the number of tuples and satisfying all these constraints. And they observed that applying all these fancy optimization logic, they were able to reduce it by 1 order of magnitude, right? In some sense, you can say, like, 1 order of magnitude is great, right? Like, you don't always get system solution that can reduce things by 1 order of magnitude. But from the practicality perspective, this is still a huge amount of load for the stream processor to handle, right? Like, if I'm sending order of 100 millions of tuples to a stream processor, then I have to, run a lot of cores to handle that volume of traffic, right? So yes, it is success, but it is not as exciting because I still am overwhelming the stream processor, right? And this is forcing us to question, why is that the case? Like, it seems very intuitive that you have these resources, you just push as many queries or operators as possible to the switch. It should have a more significant impact, right? Because especially if I'm able to offload a significant number of stateful operators that are reducing the load by orders of magnitude, right? So distinct that we were talking about, or the reduce operator that we were talking about, they can have a significant impact in the workload reduction, but I don't see that as part of this solution yet, right? So these researchers started exploring that why query partitioning as is not really working, right? And they observed that a lot of time, the memory that is required for a particular stateful operator is more than what a particular ALU or single ALU can support, right? So what ends up happening is that, for this type of query, if the distinct operation is the first stateful operator that needs to be applied, it requires 20 megabytes of memory, and there's no way you have 20 megabytes of memory available, right? So once that happens, for those set of queries, you have no choice. You just have to send all tuples to the stream processor for further processing, right? And this is one reason why this type of approach was not really as effective, because you cannot do anything if you need more memory than what's available on the switch. Okay, so this feels a bit helpless, but it should not be like that, right? There should be some insight that we can extract from the way these network traffic, like the type of patterns that they exhibit, the type of behavior that they exhibit. We should be able to extract something from that and do something better. So what is that something? The observation was that when we're talking about this type of monitoring task, we're always looking for a needle in a haystack, right? What like needle in a haystack, basically, we're looking for some type of anomaly in the network, right? So when we're looking for this type of attack, when we're looking for outages, when we're looking for something else, we're always interested in, we're not interested in normal behavior. We're more interested in the anomalous behavior of the network, which means that the portion of traffic that is interesting for a particular analytics task is a very, very small fraction of the total traffic, right? Which means that we should not be spending resources on things that are not interesting. And it all, then it means that, we should be doing something where we are like selective about how we spend resources. We are cautious about, okay, let's not spend all resources blindly. Let's take a step back, conservatively spend resources. Only when we find things are interesting, then we spend more resources on that particular portion of the traffic, right? So this is the intuition that that the researchers had, and what they tried to do was that well, actually, I'm skipping steps here. So another observation that they had was that it is actually possible to reduce the memory footprint of a particular query, right? So like, remember this query, it was trying to extract the interesting traffic, or the traffic that is victim of a particular DNS reflection attack at the granularity of a host, right? But if I try to run the same query by, rather than considering all 32 bits of the destination IP, I only consider the 8 bits of the destination IP, right? So then for the distinct operation, I will be using 24 bits less. For the reduce operation, I will be using 24 bits less, right? And that can translate into significant gains in terms of how much memory I need for a particular query, right? But now you might be wondering, like, is that really meaningful, right? So if I'm running this query at a cursor level, is that something really meaningful? Maybe /8 is a bit extreme example, but think about it this way, that if there is a attack going on, and if I'm counting the number of unique responses coming, rather than counting at the granularity of a single host, if I count at the granularity of a prefix one level up, right? So maybe I'm only counting for all traffic that is coming into the Harold Frank Hall, right? So if there is some type of anomalous pattern, even when I'm counting for all the traffic coming for Harold Frank Hall, I might still see some anomaly compared to what the normal, pattern is going to be, right? So for example, any normal day, if I just count the distinct number of sources sending traffic to any IP within Harold Frank Hall, that might be, say, 100, right? And now when I'm looking at this, like all of a sudden I see that there is some there is a scenario where I'm actually seeing thousands of responses, like unique source IP sending traffic to any of the hosts in Harold Frank Hall, right? So that is an interesting cue for me that, oh, there is something interesting going on. Let's spend more resources and look at each and every host in Harold Frank Hall and try to see if there is one specific host that is a victim of a reflection attack, right? So this is the intuition that the system has, and it is called iterative refinement, where the idea is that we run the query at a cursor level, right? And we try to identify, try to see for like very strong signals that are evident even when we are looking at the query at a cursor level, right? And once we catch those signals, then we zoom in and then try to extract like the exact specific host or exact specific victim of a particular attack, right? So this is the intuition. And I think again, I was skipping steps here in my excitement that there is another important observation that when I'm doing this, when, say, for example, I'm running a query that is trying to extract the information at the destination IP, if I try to extract the information at the destination IP /8, where a prefix that is like a representative of this IP, I'm actually able to preserve the query accuracy. Like basically, if there is an attack on a particular host in Harold Frank Hall, and if I'm counting things for Harold Frank Hall, I guarantee that I'm not going to miss out the attack traffic, right? Because the victim is somewhere in this network, right? So I'm able to preserve the accuracy of the query. I'm not missing out on the traffic that is of interest. It's just like how I should tune my threshold so that I don't miss that signal is the question, right? But it is like, I'm like, the way I'm designing this solution, whatever is the traffic of interest, right? Like not just the victim IPs, whatever is the traffic of interest that I'm interested, like I really care about. With this type of hierarchical approach that I'm taking, where I'm counting or running the query at a cursor level, I'm making sure that I don't miss the interesting part. It's just like the signals will be a bit weaker because there will be a lot of noise because I'm running this query for a much coarser level of granularity, right? Yes.
How does that solve, I guess, the bigger problem at that first level?
Yes. Yes. So this is an excellent question, and the key idea is that, like, let's think that this haystack, like taking that example to the extreme, that you have this normal packets or normal traffic, and there is this needle that you're really interested in, right? You execute the query at a cursor level, and now you know that you're going to take lesser amount of resources for executing that query, right? And then the output is that you're able to zoom in and figure out that, okay, this is the portion of traffic which is Harold Frank Hall, or think about this, that I'm running this query at UCSB, And rather than running it at /32, I run it at /24. And /24 is the granularity at which I can distinguish between different buildings, right? So I can make some sense out of it. So what will happen is that the output will say that, okay, Harold Frank Hall is the interesting portion of the traffic. So rather than running that finer granularity query on all input traffic, I will only run it on the portion of traffic that satisfied the previous query, right? So then I will zoom in, but only on Harold Frank Hall traffic, not on the entire campus traffic, right? Which means that even though I'm running this query at a much finer granularity, but I've reduced the number of tuples that are input to this query, which means that that can translate into a smaller memory footprint overall, right? So this is the key idea that, in the first stage, it is because it is able to reduce the memory footprint by running the query at a coarser level. In the second stage, it is able to reduce the memory footprint because it is filtering out majority of traffic that is uninteresting, right? And in some sense, as I was getting earlier, that it is leveraging this observation that not everything is interesting, right? So most of the traffic is boring. It's not worth spending resources on. So it is trying to run this coarser query, which is like trying to look for these weaker signals and then zoom in and then find these finer granularity information. Yes.
Assuming we eventually zoom into the single host level, we essentially regress to a previous solution that we set before. If we can run it, why not run it?
What do you mean it doesn't work? So it doesn't work because you need more memory than is required. But now you have reduced the memory footprint by zooming in on a specific portion of the traffic.
Did we ever do it on that wish list?
Yes. No. So we can, you can keep iterating depending on, so this is much more complex problem. Like, how do you zoom in? What is the right strategy? So that is a research question of how do you come up with that? But technically, if I just take that simple example of Harold Frank Hall /24 versus /32, I run the first query at /24. I know Harold Frank Hall prefix is the most interesting prefix, right? Then only for the traffic that is coming in for Harold Frank Hall, I apply this finest query which is counting at the /32, and then I'm able to report that like my laptop is a victim or my server is a victim of this attack, right? So overall, the intuition here is that I am able to set these thresholds the right way, that the signals are strong enough for me to not miss them, but come up with a plan which is reducing the memory footprint in the first go, and then the filters are efficient enough that then when you're running this query at the second granularity, then the memory footprint is small enough. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
We run on campus level looking at buildings, and then we find the building, and we find a second filter.
Yes. Okay. Now there's a catch here, right? So the catch here is that whatever event you're interested in, for example, attack traffic, it should last long enough that when I'm zooming in, it still exists, right? Say, for example, I said that the window for which I'm computing these metrics is 3 seconds. If this event that is launching an attack is less than 3 seconds or just 3 seconds, then when I zoom in, I won't find that interesting traffic, right? I won't find that pattern at all. So this is the limitation, or the fundamental trade-off that this solution provides, is that it is only able to detect events that are lasting long enough that after multiple iterations you're still able to find those patterns, right? So if something is very, very small, that is, you can think of them as ephemeral events that they just occur and then just vanish, the system will not be able to find that, right? But if these events are persistent enough that there is consistently attack traffic coming from these IP addresses, then after zooming in, I will still be able to find those patterns and detect this traffic of interest. Okay. So as you can see, how are we doing on time? Okay, we have 10 minutes. Okay. So as you can imagine that, now when we're trying to make these type of decisions, the problem of query planning becomes a bit more challenging, right? So earlier we were just deciding that, okay, which set of operators should be sent to the switch, but now we have to make an additional decision about how should I be zooming in for a particular query, right? And it is all data driven because different queries will have different type of structures. Maybe there is significant memory footprint reduction for a particular query when I'm running at /8, but maybe for other queries, it's not the same thing, right? So it all depends on how exactly these queries are structured, what exactly are their memory footprint requirement at the coarser level, at each levels of granularity. And the query planning problem needs to determine that, one, which packet field to use for iterative refinement, right? So, in this query, we identified that destination IP is the one where it makes more sense because that is the victim IP that you're trying to figure out. But given an arbitrary query, it's not a trivial question to answer. So like from research perspective, the system has to reason that what is the best field that I should be picking for this type of refinement, right? So for example, I could have chosen a source IP as well, right? Because technically it can help me reduce the memory requirement here, but that's not the ultimate like output that I'm interested in. So it is not really as beneficial. It might help with this operator, but not with this operator. Right? And then what levels to use for refinement, right? So I just made up that /8 or /24, but in UCSB, we know that /24 is a reasonable choice because that's where the buildings are distributed. But in some other network, this decision can be completely different, right? I don't know, right? So as an operator, I don't know what is the most interesting distribution here. I need to learn this empirically, right? And then once you make this decision that, okay, I'm going to run this query at /8, /24, and /32. So now you have 3 queries to run. And now you have 3 partitioning decisions to make that, okay, for the /8 query, which set of operators should be sent to the switch and which set of operators should be running in the user space, and so on and so forth, right? So the decision space has increased. Like now I have to make more decisions, and the set of constraints that I have to take into consideration have also significantly increased. The approach, and I don't think we need to get into the details of how exactly this paper solves this problem, but it just to simply understand, it is augmenting the ILP, which is integer linear program, to encode all these constraints and goals as additional set of objectives that need to be satisfied. And it is just relying on these existing tools for which can find an optimal solution to the problem. I have to mention that the authors don't claim to find the optimal solution, right? Because if you rely on an integer linear program to find the optimal solution, it can take ages to get to that final answer, right? But they're happy with the good enough solution, because even if the solution is non-optimal, but it is closer to the optimal, it is still able to significantly reduce the load at the stream processor. And now when you revisit this graph that we were looking at earlier, with just the partitioning, the workload reduction was 1 order of magnitude. But with this refinement that I was describing and partitioning combined together, it is actually able to find better opportunities to execute this query in the hardware switch, and then able to reduce the load by 4 orders of magnitude, right? And 4 orders of magnitude, or when you have this setup where you only have to process 100,000 packets, I can just make it work with 1 core, right? So that's a significant. Again, I'm talking about 100 Gbps workload and 8 concurrent queries that need to be run, and being able to just use 1 core to give the final answer. That's a huge achievement as a system, right? So that was kind of a great result, and basically demonstrating that partitioning and refinement combined together can find better opportunities to execute or scale the execution of this query given a particular hardware target. Right? So this is a good way to end the lecture. That the takeaways that we want to have from this this lecture is that, one, Sonata is supporting flexibility. It is letting these operators express the monitoring task as a data flow query over packet tuples. Something that I didn't zoom in further in this class was when we embrace this data flow abstraction, it simplifies how we express these tasks, right? And actually, this paper shows that any type of a wide range, like it picks up 10 different type of analytics tasks, and then it shows that the maximum number of lines of code that you need is 20, right? And all of you have written P4 programs. You know that you can't write anything in 20 lines of code, right? It's a complex thing. Like you have to define the ingress pipeline, egress control, and then you have to specify each and every match action table. So if I ask a network operator to write the P4 program for this query, which has a distinct reducer on all those operators, I know technically that this can all be written down as a combination of match action table, but then that will be hundreds of lines of code that I have to write, right? So the value of this system is that it is automatic. You can just express your intent or task as a data flow query, and then it figures out that, okay, this is the best way of refining this query, this is the best way of partitioning this query, and then it auto generates the P4 program and then compiles that into the hardware target, right? So this is one big contribution of this work in general. And we talked about refinement and partitioning as 2 strategies that this system embraces to scale. And we learned that for so 4 order of magnitude, I would say take it with a grain of salt, right? Because it all depends on what type of hardware target this paper is using. It also depends on what type of workload it is taking into consideration, right? So take that with a grain of salt, but it at least demonstrate that for a given workload, for a given target, it is able to do much better than what was the state of the art. And finally, I would just want to say that I mentioned earlier that this paper did a good job of setting a goalpost. It does a good job of demonstrating that those goals are achievable, but I won't claim or I won't say that Sonata is the perfect solution for the problem at hand, right? Like it's a good first step solution, but it's not a final solution. And it can only support maybe 8-10 queries at a time. So that is one limitation, that even though we want, maybe as a network operator, I want to support hundreds or maybe thousands of queries. There is no way Sonata can support that, right? Like it needs more innovation to think about what will that mean if I want to support hundreds of queries, or do I really need to run hundreds of queries? That's a completely different research question of its own. And second is that Sonata cannot handle dynamics at all, right? So when I say dynamics, if as I said, right, like these 4 orders of magnitude, the performance gain is coming for a particular data set or particular traffic pattern, right? That traffic is coming from a real world link that is connecting 2 different cities for a particular ISP, right? So it's realistic. But the challenge is that the moment that the traffic patterns change, that there is more traffic coming for a particular IP address and less traffic coming for a particular IP address, Sonata cannot handle that, right? So it is just tuned for a particular type of distribution, particular type of traffic, and it cannot handle that. Also, it can only handle a static query workload, which means that if I give you 8 queries, it is super optimized for those 8 queries. If I add a 9th query, it will just fail, right? So there is this fragility that exists in the system, but it is from conceptual point of view, it is a good progress. It's a good intellectual progress that yes, we can achieve that goal, but there are miles to go before we can have that ultimate goal satisfied, where we want to build a system where we can support hundreds of queries, we can support hundreds of terabytes, hundreds of gigabytes. Hundreds of terabytes is too ambitious. I don't want to go there. But I think there are these new recent works that I think I won't be able to cover in this class that are able to handle some of these challenges that Sonata poses, right? All right. Okay, so yeah, that brings us to the end of this lecture. I think before I let you folks go, I just want to make sure, I hope I was recording this. Okay, I was recording it. Thank you.